of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we go about studying your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. All right, we've already talked about some. Who are the figures we've talked about to this point? What's that? Adam and Eve, and okay, Cain and Abel, God, Noah. Okay, so you know all about those folks. What's that?
They're popular.
They're popular names. You know, a lot of people name their kids. Use those to name the kids. You know, I grew up in a neighborhood where the guy that lived next door to me was named God. You know, so they were pretty arrogant. But you know.
What were his kids' names?
Yeah.
Kids? Jesus?
No, yeah, well, Jesus, you know.
One was God and the other was damn.
And they were twins. Yeah. Now, you understand Nigerians may be confused by that, but that's okay. All right, so we've talked about, and if you were talking about God, what would be some characteristics? I mean, what do you say about God? All powerful, compassionate. Okay, that's enough, because that's the two sides. Kind of compassionate enough. If you talk about Adam and Eve, you're talking about. Yeah, made a mistake, nice young couple, you know, probably should have dated longer, you know, made a mistake.
In his defense. Never knew that.
That's a wonderful image, God making clothes, because it doesn't say he spoke and clothes appeared. It says he made clothes for us.
It's so amazing, man.
It's amazing.
It's important for me to learn things.
Cain and Abel. Kills his brother. You know, Cain kills his brother. Okay. Noah. Build a boat.
Follow the directions.
Yes, follow the directions. I put together an IKEA dresser for my daughter yesterday. I felt like I was building an ark. You know. Yes, that's right. So anyway, but build a boat. Also, as soon as he hits dry land, Noah does what?
Well, he sends a bird out.
Well, he sends a bird out. Bird comes back. Olive, you know, then Noah. But then he gets on ground and offers a sacrifice and says, hot dog, I got all this land. I think I'll plant a vineyard. And since I got all these grapes, I think I deserve to get a little. Yes, I deserve to chill a little bit. Yeah, not eat them. He's not eating them. He's fermenting them. And when he ferments them, he makes wine, and he, of course, bathes in it. Yeah. That's when, according to Scripture, they invent the first straw, and so he gets drunk, and his son Ham or Canaan, depends on which one you want to look at, goes in and sees
his butt.
Dad naked on the bed.
Dad naked on the bed.
And they never saw his butt.
And yeah, probably not. Never mentioned in the Bible.
Thank goodness.
Yes. And he goes out and says, hey, to his brothers, hey, you want to see something good? And his brothers say, bring your phone. Yeah, bring your phone. Your brothers say, you disgusting pig. And they cover him up. And Noah wakes up, and says to Ham or Canaan.
Do you have an aspirin?
Well, that's after the aspirin. And he says, Canaan, you are cursed. You are cursed. Okay. So, and then we got Tower of Babel. What happens in the Tower of Babel?
Well, they were strong.
People get arrogant.
Strong people get arrogant, build a tower to reach to God, and God says, enough of this foolishness.
Yes.
I'm going to scatter them, and they're going to have different languages.
They wanted to build, thinking that would build, because when they disappeared, when Christ went, this is before Christ. Huh?
Yeah, it is, but where you're going is right. Because that's one reason why they will use the same Hebrew word kavod for glory and cloud,
Yeah.
It'll be the same word, because the perception is if you go above clouds, then you're going into another realm. And that's why mountains are so fascinating for me. And that's why when Moses is on the mountain, it talks about all this fire and cloud, because he goes up there. This is entering a different realm. You are entering glory when you enter the cloud, just because you don't do that very often. And so, yeah, where you're going is exactly right. They feel as though if they can build this into the clouds, that they will be God. Not unlike the South Park episode when they're building the tower to heaven. You know, that you assume you build a tower high enough, you will end up being in heaven. And so that's what they're trying to do.
Well, you know, they were stupid then.
Well, they really...
It's more of a symbolic thing, though. It's not like,
just symbolic.
it's not that they really thought they were going to reach heaven. I mean, maybe they did think that, but you know, I mean, we kind of think that, you know, I mean, I kind of think that, you know, I think it was more of the symbolicness of trying to be like God.
I agree with that, but also, how about the early explorers? They thought they were going to go out there and drop off.
Or off the edge of the earth.
Into the end.
Sure.
Yeah.
They might not have known that they couldn't reach heaven, you know.
Yeah.
It was beyond their intelligence.
But that's what, you know, that's what pyramids are. That's what ziggurats are. They're mountains. You know, they're building mountains with the goal that if when you're on top, you're closest to God. You're closer to God there than you're down below. Or the gods, you know. Anyway, so we've got that. God says, I've enough of this, scatters them. Human condition by the time we get to the end of the Babel story. Pretty rough. They can't even communicate with one another.
Right.
You know, so all relationship is kind of broken, and that's when we enter chapter 12, and that's what we're going to be looking at, chapter 12. Because there's a little bit at the end of chapter 11, but we're not worried about that. Although the character is introduced at the end of chapter 11. If you look at chapter 11, verse 27, we have a name that's going to be important later. And what is that name? And all those names, because remember, we got some of these guys who, part of the tradition that's being put into Genesis, are kind of bean counters. They really like names. We got a whole bunch of names here, but one of them kind of elevates itself above the others. And that name is Abram. And you know, one of the things that's really interesting, and just file away as we talk about Abram, and that's what we're going to look at. 2 weeks we're going to look at Abram. Abram, the name means, does anybody know about what the name Abram means?
It's Abraham.
Well, Abraham means something else. But Abram, what does Abram mean in Hebrew?
Brother, soldier.
You're in the neighborhood. Abram means father, or exalted father, special father. That's what Abram means. Now that's really kind of going to be important when we start getting into the story. So we've got him sort of appearing. Now when we, and a little bit of his history, living in Mesopotamia with his daddy, his uncle, whose name will play a role later, Lot, you know, living in Mesopotamia. At the beginning of chapter 12, who shows up to Abram? Okay, the Lord, which tells us immediately before we even see anything, what? If it's the Lord showing up,
It's important.
it's important and coming from all this Lord tradition. You know, the second chapter, the Lord, we've talked about that before. The proper name for God is what appears here. So it's not the bean counters, you know, the ones who call God God. It's the ones who call God Lord, or by those 4 Hebrew letters. Okay, so all of a sudden the Lord appears. And what does the Lord say to the exalted Father?
Go get your family.
Go get your family. Imperative, go and do what?
Start a new nation.
Okay, bang, go, and you're going to be the beginning of a new nation. Now, where is he supposed to go?
To the land that he will show.
Okay, you're going to go. You don't know where you're going right now. But I'm going to show you. And when you get there, you were going to be what?
Jewish.
Okay, in a sense, you're going to be what? You're going to be a great nation. You're going to be the father, exalted father, of a great nation. And what you bless, I'll bless. What you curse. Everybody, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. Now, that's going to be a big deal later for Christians, as Christians start, after the Christ event in the church starts organizing, starts going through the Old Testament to find allusions to Christ, the idea that Abraham is going to be a blessing to the nations. Boy, that kind of sounds like there's a connection between he and Christ. Okay, but it's not happening here yet, because we're talking about, pre-Jesus. Okay, so now why is Abram picked? Excellent. You shrugged. Art says, I don't know. It doesn't say. And if it doesn't say, it's not important. It's not important. So it would be wrong to assume Abram was chosen because he was more righteous than anybody else in the land. That's what we heard about Noah. Because it does say that about Noah. He's a righteous man. But it doesn't say anything about Abram. Now that becomes kind of interesting. Because by not mentioning qualities in Abram that made him picked, chosen, that means the action is all God's action, the Lord's action. It's not like Abram somehow deserved what God said. Abram was chosen by God. Now,
then my thinking, then it is important, because God is doing the action, so that's God's choice.
Yes.
But we don't think it's important because he doesn't tell us why he did it.
Right.
Doesn't matter.
Right.
It's God.
That's exactly that. You said that better than I did. That is, I think, exactly what's going on here. This is a focus on the Lord's choice. The Lord is making the choice. Now, what he does is he's making a covenant, right? A contract. Because he's saying contracts have to have two sides. You don't have a contract with one side. And what is the contract he's making, the Lord is making with Abram? Okay, this is what I'm going to give you. Yeah, this is what I'm going to give you. I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be the exalted father of a whole bunch of people, right? Okay, this is what I'm going to... Now, contract's got to have two sides. If you only got one side, it's not a contract. So what is coming from the other side? This is what the Lord is going to do for Abram. What is Abram supposed to do for the Lord?
Obey.
Okay, obey him. And what's the obeying?
What the Lord's blessing him, so he's going to bless people.
Okay, well, true. Well, even before that, what does the Lord say to Abram? One word. Yes. Go. Go, and I'm going to lead you. Go, and I'm going to lead you your side. You don't know where you're going, I'll show you. My side, I'm going to make you a blessing to not only yourself and your family, but you're going to be a blessing to many, 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 many nations. Okay. So we've got Abram. The contract is made. This is what God's going to do. What does Abram do?
That's what he's told.
He goes. And he goes. Verse 4. Abram goes. And the writer, again, and it's what makes it really exciting when you look at Scripture is, and we've talked about it before, since what they're writing on is so incredibly precious, when they include stuff, they aren't just throwing in words. I wrote something today. I wrote several things today. I threw all kinds of words in that didn't need to be used. Jeez Louise, to make it sound fancy. So I throw in a bunch of words. Well, why can I throw in a bunch of words?
But you have plenty of paper.
I'm not even using paper. I'm writing it on the computer. I'm not using paper at all. I can put as many words as I want. Therefore, I don't have to be judicious in the words I choose. These guys got to be really judicious. And so when he said Abram went, the writer adds, as the Lord told him. So the writer is telling us that not only did Abram go, but he went
Because of God.
because of God. Because God told him to go,
Yeah.
Abram went. Okay? Which shows something about Abram, right? And what does it show about Abram that we didn't know before?
He's obedient.
He's obedient. That's exactly right.
What did God look like to him?
What did God look like? Well, that's a great question, because when we look at these Lord stories that use the proper name for God, God is often personified, is described in very human terms. I mean, we know we're looking at a Lord story when we see God walking in the garden.
Yeah.
Man, you don't see that in the first chapter. God doesn't walk through the creation, in chapter 1, but he's walking in the garden. God has a personal conversation with Cain. Where is your brother? You don't see that in the first chapter. God has a conversation with Noah. You don't see that in the bean counter accounts. So how does the writer want us to see God? I think as intensely personal. And we're going to see this later in the Abraham story. But in this Abram story, I think the writer would want us, when he's writing this, to whom he's writing, would want us to see this is really personal. Whether he looks up and sees the face of God or not, or whether God is there present with him. I think it's a real personal connection.
Why he's honoring them by his vision. Why doesn't he do it anymore? Now, when you said vision, that's going to be another account where God appears in visions. And they're going to call him something else. That God tends to appear in dreams. This, I think, the intention of the writer here as he's telling the story. And he may be telling the story to people who will say, this is the way it was at the beginning. Ask the same question you asked. In the beginning, God walked through gardens. I mean, you could have face-to-face conversations with God. How come we can't do that anymore? And I think the one telling the story would go, this is a story. This is a story. This is showing that intimacy, that closeness. Yeah, yes.
I accept the reason that you don't have it anymore is because God doesn't want it.
Yeah.
God doesn't want to do it.
What we're going to
That's what I can accept that.
Sure. Okay. And what we're going to see, even in the stories here, even in the Lord story, because we're going to see this straying, and it's going to go all through the book, all the way through the books of the Kings. Way into the history. Where sometimes God is called God, sometimes he's called Lord. The God side is going to be in the books of the Chronicles, which is really, really very different than the books of the Kings, of Samuel and the Kings, same story. But God becomes, as time goes, more and more distant. Which is exactly what Hugh is saying. Becomes more and more. And so it's sort of like, and we see it now, but because we're so tied to rationalism, we don't see it quite as much. But we saw it maybe 300 years ago, 400 years ago, where, people would say, in the old times, when the gods were all around us, where you could have personal conversation with God. Only it's not God, the gods, it's God. In these old days, when we were so close to God, you could talk to him like I'm talking to you. That day doesn't exist anymore. That's in the past. God, that's not the way he communicates anymore. But back then, the relationship was so close, you could have a face-to-face conversation.
A lot fewer people then.
Yeah, well, remember, and these are stories. This isn't a guy saying, I'm going to write the historical account of Abram. Because the person writing it is living 500, 1,000 years after this is supposed to take place. It's transmitted orally, the stories, but they're not writing it down for 1,000 years. And so when they write it down 1,000 years, they're very aware that they're writing a story that has powerful meaning to people now. The people who are reading it the first time. but reflect a time that no longer exists. I mean, does that make sense? Because, we even see it, good night, we even see it in our country. Whenever somebody starts talking about, well, if we could have the founding fathers, they are the ones that guide us, as though they are some source of divine wisdom, we kind of almost deify them. They gave us the Constitution, which Mormons believe came from God, directly from God. They gave us, and if we could only understand what they were thinking. Well, you know what they were? A bunch of incredibly smart people who were in an unusual situation, who came out with some really exciting things, but they weren't smarter than us. They weren't.
When I was watching a show last week about some of that, I thought, oh geez, now I have to tell Ed this. How many of them the leaders came from the Virginia area?
Thank you very much. It's in the soil, it's in the water. That's right. This was Virginia too. In fact, Alaska was part of Virginia. But that's what it is. You're describing a time that's passed, and you're looking at it as this wonderful. But the point is more, what do the stories mean? How do they apply?
They're the lesson.
Yes, they're the lessons. One of the things we're going to see when we look at Isaac, and that's going to be Abraham's son.
Yeah.
And again, this is an unusual when you look at ancient people. Abraham and Jacob are going to identify with locations in southern Palestine, in the southern part of the land. All the Hebron, Bathsheba, all of these are going to be southern places. When you start looking at the Isaac story, all of a sudden you got places that are on the north. So Isaac is associated with all these northern places. Well, what the writer has done, what the compiler has done, is he's taken stories and welded them into a story. Instead of having 20 different stories, he's taken them and saying it's all one story, which makes it, to me, even more remarkable, that he is combining the stories. We're going to see that, in fact, in here with a king that has a name that should from a place that causes all kinds of red flags to go up, because the name just doesn't make sense. Evidently is a source of another story that the writer has melded into this, which means there's not 50 stories of God. There is one. There's one story of God, and this is it. Which really becomes neat, because they're talking about almost a prehistoric time, because nobody is writing this down.
It's word of mouth.
It's word of mouth. Okay, so we got Abram going, right? And he takes along his uncle, Lot. And Lot, and they used to call Lot, he was a large man. He was a really large man. And that's why they called him Big Lots. There was a lot to Lot. There's a lot to love to Lot. Yes, exactly. All right, so Abram is going, and we know this is kind of because if I use this word, I don't want you to think that I'm saying, oh, none of this is true. It's kind of a fanciful time, because how old is Abram when he leaves? 75, for crying out loud. How long are people living? 900 years. Jeez Louise. This is a different time. It's not that they're measuring years different. This is a different time. Anybody that's into fantasy literature, they all talk about a different time when there were blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's right.
Even movies are like that.
Exactly, and that's what it is. Now, he leaves, he goes. Now, the reader of the story again, and this is what's cool, because they're bringing these stories together. What land does Abram end up in?
Canaan.
Before he goes to Egypt, right? He goes to Canaan. Jeez Louise, I'm experiencing deja vu. Yes, Hugh is too. I can tell.
Well, God's telling him what to do, but God didn't tell him to take Lot, did he?
No, Lot just goes along.
I skipped ahead.
Yeah, because the covenant is with Abram,
Right.
not with Lot.
So, but God allowed him to go along. He must have some reason then.
A witness.
Well, I think because Lot's going to play a part in the story later. Realistically, Abram didn't leave alone. I mean, he took stuff with him, other stuff with him, and other people with him. But Lot, yes, the fact that Lot's mentioned again, because the material is precious, we can bet that Lot's going to be come into the story at some point. Okay, so he travels to the land of Canaan. Now when we see the land of Canaan, man, rockets start shooting off. Because we have seen that name before.
Yeah.
When have we seen Canaan before?
Noah.
Yeah, well, that was either the person or the son of the person who saw Noah buck naked in his tent, right? And that's the one, regardless of whether it's the person or the son, that's the one who carries the curse. So God is leading Abram where? To a land full of cursed people. He is sending them, to downtown Steubenville. That's or to, downtown Detroit. That's what he's doing. Because this is he's sending them to a rough place. Not a paradise on earth, but a land of cursed people. Now, he goes past certain things. And I love this because this is precious. He goes as he travels, passes through a place called Shechem. Now, why is Shechem important?
No idea.
Good. You don't know, but it will be.
No.
It will be.
Good.
So he goes Bethel, pitches his tent at Bethel. And when he does that, he builds. What does he build? He builds an altar, which shows that he is what? If he builds an altar, he's going to perform sacrifices. He recognizes the Lord.
Could one look at that as also an early form of like preaching gospel?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, now it says, where does he live? Where does he live? Where does Abram live? Where does it say he lives? Physically where, not location. But does he live in a house? He lives in tents, which say, what is Abram if he's living in tents? He's a nomad. He's a herder. Now again, I'm experiencing deja vu all over again. Back in an earlier story, we had good guys and bad guys, or people that offered sacrifices that were more acceptable than others. We had Cain the farmer versus Abel the herder, and Abram is a herder. So he is following the good way of life. His sacrifice is going to be accepted. One of the things you see in the Old Testament, my goodness, and you kind of file it away because it's not a major part of the story, but it's important, is this tension between herders and farmers. Just like in the Old West, the cattlemen, the sheep herders, and the farmers, that are always having problems in Western movies. In the Bible, there's a tension between farmers and people who herd. And part of the reason is the people who herd are the ones who are led by God. Farmers do not want to be led by God.
They stay in the same place.
That's it. Farmers stay in the same place. What they want is God to make their land fertile. And you're talking about worshiping a whole different set images for God, rather than the God who leads us through the wilderness or leads us to still waters. We're not talking when you're a farmer, you don't want God to lead you to pastures. You want God to make your dirt fertile so it grows. You want God to control the rain so it comes at the right time of year. You are talking about worshiping a whole different set of gods than the God who leads you through the wilderness. and that's going to be the tension. And we saw it alluded to at the beginning when the serpent became the villain in the second chapter story. That tension between settled agricultural societies and nomadic herders. Okay, so we've got he is following the preferred way of life, and so when he builds an altar, burns up his animal on the altar, it is pleasing to the Lord. Okay, so he's there, goes to Canaan. What happens in Canaan? Verse 10. Famine. You got a famine in the land, right? Again, one of these things you got to be careful. When you're a farmer, when you settle down, because there are famines, and sometimes it doesn't rain. You got problems. You can't move your farm around, and there's a famine in the land. And so what does Abram do? He hits the road. With who? Or whom? Sarai, his wife, right? So Sarai and Abram hit the road and they head to Egypt. Now understand, the guy who's compiling this story is very aware that what's going to happen later in the history of Israel. Egypt's going to play a big role. They're going to come out of Egypt. So Egypt is a loaded location, is a loaded term. He's very aware of this. So they go into Egypt, not unlike the story of Jacob and his sons, because that's why they end up in Egypt, because there's a famine in the land. And he goes with his wife Sarai. Now how is Sarai described? She is hot.
But she couldn't have kids.
Yeah, okay, but you couldn't have kids. Now that barren business is going to be important later. But Sarai is hot, or as the Greeks would say, hotus. And she goes, and Abram out, but he's doing this, and remember, precious, so they're including this story for a reason. Abram starts thinking, as he looks at, Sarai, and he looks at the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are going, fine. What does he start thinking? They are going to kill me and to get at my wife, right? And so I got a perfect plan, and I'll tell you, Debbie and I did this when we... What does Abram decide he's going to do?
Going to disguise.
Yes, he's going to disguise, and he's going to call Sarai his sister.
Yeah.
His sister. Yeah.
Nothing could go wrong with this.
Nothing can go wrong. Sounds like something out of the Partridge Family or the Brady Bunch. He's going to call Sarai his sister. And he's doing it for some very self-serving reasons, right? He's doing it so the Egyptians won't kill him. But the underlying assumption is the Egyptians are going to do what? Take her. That's why he's doing it. He's not doing it because if he calls her his sister, the Egyptians will leave her alone. No. No. They're going to, and naturally, what happens?
She was a free woman, so.
Yeah, hot dog. Pharaoh says, well, first thing he says is hubba hubba, which is an old Egyptian term. He says hubba da hubba, and he says to an official, bring her here. And so she is taken into his house. Fortunately, it was a big house, and she got her own suite. And that's when they made the movie in the 50s. But when she was brought into his house, she was brought into his harem. So she is brought into his harem, right? Yeah, it is. Well, You know, kind of. Depends on how.
Good parts of bad stuff. Well, the guy smiled and the two ladies. Like,
Yes.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, so well, she's brought in. And what makes matters worse, you know, Abram is doing this to protect himself, but he really comes out good on this deal, right? Because what ends up happening to Abram?
He gets a ton of livestock.
Man, he is getting livestock right and left. To say nothing of, you know, I love the list. He got sheep, he got oxen, he got male donkeys, he got male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. You know, geez Louise. And this is the first. What's that?
You get camels.
Hey, I'm telling you. And this is the first example of smoking in the Bible. So he's getting all this stuff, right? And so he is soaking up the livestock, you know. But what happens to Pharaoh? He gets a plague, right? Because he's done what? Taken Abram's wife. Okay. Now, this is, again, geez, I'm experiencing deja vu because we got going into Egypt, we've got plagues. Boy, that sounds like another story we're going to see later. Coming out of Egypt a little bit later. All right, so Pharaoh has got plagues, and nobody wants plagues. You know, they really don't. It's. I had them in high school. It's not good. And so, what does Pharaoh do?
Calls up Abram.
What have you done to me? You know, why didn't you tell me she was Mrs. Abram? Right? You know, why did you say his sister? Now, I want you to do what? What does he tell Abram to do? You got to take her and get out. And Abram says, can I take the stuff you gave me with me? Can I take my stuff with me? And Pharaoh says, do you promise to get the plagues to stop? And Abram says, I've got it on good authority. And Pharaoh says, take the female donkeys, the male donkeys, the slaves, the Marlboros, camels, take them and go. Right? And so Abram says, nice knowing you. And he hits the road, right? Now, why do you think? Now, again, we're talking about a time when what you're writing on is precious. The Jews, the organizer of Genesis, whoever it is, him, them, are choosing what to put in their sacred writings. Why in heaven's name, knowing Abram is going to be important in the story? They are the children of, they're not the children of Lot, they're the children of Abraham, right? Right? Why would he include, or they include this story in their canon? Why would they include this story?
What part of it?
The whole schmear. Going to Egypt, coming back, lying about his wife. We don't read this, or at least I don't read this and say, boy, Abram, man, he was really a smart guy. What a good business person. I mean, this is not putting him in a great light. And he's going to be a hero, right?
And there he was with his wife. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That would really burn my butt.
Yeah, well, he didn't mind because he was getting all those male donkeys. You know, he was okay with that.
You don't get rid of your wife for a donkey.
But he's taking this.
A donkey and a camel.
Oh, that's way more valuable than your wife.
Yeah. Remember.
We are outnumbered tonight.
Yeah. Remember. In the Old Testament law, on the Sabbath, if your wife fell into one hole and your ox fell into another, you could help out. Hey, you could help the ox.
Well, back into wife is more plural than singular.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
well, you always had something to fall back.
Which sounds better, and I think Art would agree. What you just said sounds better when you say it in Latin.
Yeah.
They always had something to fall back on. Why would they include this story?
He kind of, takes all this stuff back to this place that was cursed. I mean, it's not like I don't know, I haven't gone skipped ahead.
Okay,
yet.
go ahead.
I haven't skipped ahead yet, but I mean, he just left a place that was suffering a bad famine, and he goes and he gets all this stuff, but he brings it back. He's giving it to everybody else that he left behind.
So all of a sudden, through this
He's a hero.
interesting story, what has God done? In kind of an interesting way here. Increased his wealth, increased his influence. If we look behind this, Abram is being blessed.
Yeah, okay.
He is being blessed. I mean, Pharaoh doesn't throw him in jail because of this. He ends up coming back to the land with more stuff than he had when he left.
By blackmail.
Yeah, by blackmail, that's right. He not only brought his wife back, he brought his wife back and the camel.
Plus, he made fun of
females.
Yes, female slaves.
In a sense, he also, kind of, like you always put it, shot to the ribs there to another pagan god.
Oh, absolutely.
To another pagan leader.
Absolutely. That God has authority, the Lord, because this is a Lord story. The Lord has authority even over Egypt.
But it's more important that God wanted Sarah to remain barren.
That's right.
He wanted her to be the vessel that's going to help lead to Christ.
Well, that's right. And we don't want to forget that Sarai is barren. And being barren, throw a dart at a woman in the Old Testament, you're going to hit one that's barren. Because there are barren women everywhere. And they always have. Which always sets us up for miracle. Sets us up for a miracle.
Yeah.
And remember that there's that irony. That Abram's name is Exalted Father. And his wife is barren, is incapable of making him a father.
That's
Right now.
For now, yes.
That's another good strategy if he knows she's barren. She's
Yeah.
not going to carry any of Pharaoh's children, so it's, in a sense, less of an issue for her to go do that, and hey, that's fine. Later on, it won't be an issue.
Well, and for
Or she's not going to carry any of Pharaoh's line, because she can't have kids.
No, but I don't know how to say this.
yeah, go ahead, Hugh.
Go ahead,
Nigerians are waiting.
Well, the Lord didn't want her womb to be
Decimated.
anything but. So she couldn't, even though she couldn't have children, she couldn't have intercourse.
Well,
She could have intercourse,
Sure.
but God didn't want her to have intercourse.
I think one of this story, even though it again conveys something to people who lived
Back then.
3,000 years ago,
Yeah.
I don't know that we would want to make a Sunday school lesson on this story. For one, there are all kinds of modern red flags that should come up. Because the one person who didn't seem to have any voice in this was her. And so I'm not sure I would tell Maggie, now, when you start dating, understand, your boyfriend, when he gets into a tough situation, but there's biblical precedent, we want to follow we don't want to do that. But I think it does show the authority of the Lord and how the Lord is working through all sorts of means to enrich Abram. And in this story, like I said, we've got so many allusions to a story that's going to come later. You know, all kinds of allusions to a story. And you know, it's like the writers, you know, the father telling the son, well, what does that mean? Wait, we'll get to it sometime next week as I continue to tell the story about your people, because Egypt's going to come up several times again. Okay, so he's out of the land of Egypt, and by the way, we're going to see this happen 2 more times. So be prepared for once Abram and then his son is going to lie, they're going to lie about their wives. Again, you know, it must be something that people did in the day. I don't know. Abram, he comes back, right? And when he comes back, he has got, what's being emphasized? He's got livestock and he's got money. You know, he is really, really cooking. And evidently so does Lot. Lot's doing okay, right? Because they...
I don't know, this kind of thing is funny. It's just thrown in there. Oh, and Lot. A little later on. The opinion, Shuri, and Lot.
And Lot, right.
Lot's just kind of hanging out there, getting rich from everybody
But
else.
you know, if you're watching, I love movies. And if you're watching a movie and you hear them mention a name, and you say, we haven't even seen this guy, you know, but they keep on mentioning him, I'll bet you
Something's going to happen.
Godzilla's going to show up.
Yeah.
You know, Godzilla's going to show up.
Guy or a bad guy?
Yeah, he's going to show up later. Because, and this is what they're writing stories. So, you know, these are good writers. You know, he's not just throwing it in and it's going to go nowhere. It's going to go somewhere, we just don't know yet.
Are you saying that the authors have a privilege of making things up?
No, I'm saying an author is shaping a story to convey a meaning. Shaping. Okay, so anyway, you got them living there. Both of them got a lot of stuff, a lot of camels and livestock, right? And they're looking, now this is a big area. Jeez Louise. But as part of the story, they can't live in the same place, right? So one of them has got to go one place and the other one is going to go another place, right? And Abram says to Lot, we don't want to be fighting over the wells and the pasture land, so why don't we kind of separate, right? And where you want to go? I'll give you right of first refusal. Where do you want to go? And Lot says,
Hell.
no, he doesn't say hell. Well, you're not as far off as you think.
I don't think.
Because Lot says, I would like to go where? I would like to go to the plain of the Jordan. Because there's water there.
And fishing.
Right? And fishing. And when you have water, you've got a lot of grass. You know, a lot of grass for your sheep and camel and donkeys and all.
And stay clean.
And so, what's that?
You can boil it and stay
That's exactly right. So he says, if I've got my choice, I'll take the land that's got the water. Right? Okay. So he goes off to the plain of Jordan. Now again, the writer drops in, there are some cities in this cultivate or fertile land. And what are a couple of those cities? Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, gee, Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, I don't know what Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh, wait a minute, you'll know, right? So he goes to the east in this wonderful plain where you have these two cities, and Abram ends up going where? To the land of Canaan, which was
Cursed.
yes, but exactly where he was initially led. Gee, look how this worked out. What if Lot had said, I want to go to the land of Canaan? You know, then you'd had a mess. No. Okay, goes there. So now, Lot goes and settles around the city of Sodom. And the writer tells us even that If you go to the city of Sodom, expect
Wickedness, great.
trouble, wickedness.
Yeah.
Don't bring your wife,
Oh,
you know. This is,
Not a nice place like Egypt.
yeah, but don't take her to Sodom. So they are really bad in Sodom. So
have that on.
yes, that's right. That's right. That's what the Chamber of Commerce put out. You know, land of wickedness.
Actually, I think I may have some of those postcards.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is when you take and we're talking about, you know, just the sound of the words, the letters in Hebrew, and you take the Sodom, and sort of transliterate. It's a transliteration. When you pronounce those letters into Spanish, which is fascinating. Sodom is Vegas. Or Las Vegas. No, I'm making that up. but you know, so yeah. So what happens? They used to say, what happens in Sodom and what happens in Gomorrah also happens in also happens in Sodom. Yes. Remember, this is a well-watered plain. So they separate.
You can talk about what happened in Egypt.
What's that?
You can talk about what happened in Egypt.
Yeah, but that's right. But not what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, though, he's in the land of Canaan, right? The land of Canaan. And what do we have once Lot's gone? Who shows up again? The Lord, right? The Lord shows up again to Abram, and he says what to Abram? Remember, you know, he talked to him earlier. Go and I will. Abram did what? Went. Okay. What does the Lord say now?
Lift up your eyes.
Lift up your eyes. You're in the middle of the land in Canaan, not prime real estate, you know, but you're the land of Canaan. Look up, look around. What do you see? It's all yours. All of it's yours. But not only is this all yours, this whole land is going to be yours. But not only that, look down at the ground. See that dust on the ground?
That's gold.
Nope. You know what that dust is?
Numerous is your
Descendants. You're going to have as many children as there's dust in the ground.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
Yeah. Now, what I want you to do is check out your territory, which is easy to do because he's a herder. So he can take his herds all around. What is God doing here? Or the Lord doing? Yeah, setting boundaries. He's restating a covenant that he's already made at the beginning of chapter 12. He's restating that covenant to Abram. You know, I said, if you go to this land, it's going to be yours. Abram went. Now that you're there, you know what, Abram? This is it. This is it. Okay, so Abram does what? Exactly what he does. He's supposed to do when he moves all around. Now we got in chapter 14. Probably the Egyptian story is an odd one. Chapter 14 is really odd. Because it's like, again, we're talking about people who are compiling this, taking stories and doing what? Melding them into one story. And here we got a story that has absolutely nothing to do, very little to do with what we've talked about, right? Because what's going on at the beginning of chapter 14? What's happening in chapter 14? We're introducing a lot of people, right? And who are all these people? We got all kinds of kings, right? We got a whole bunch of kings. And What are those kings doing? Now, we recognize some of the names, right, of the cities.
Samson.
We recognize the name of the city of Sodom. We recognize the name of the city, Gomorrah. And what do we know about Sodom and Gomorrah?
The bad place.
Oh, bad. We also know what? Lot's, Abram's uncle is living there, right, by choice. So we got all these kings, right, going to war, right? And what happens and all of this is war. You know, they are fighting. Okay, now.
You skip the name.
Oh, we got tons of names in there.
Samson.
Yeah.
Well, different. If Samson's in there, it's not the Samson. That's going to be much later with the judges. Yeah. Okay, so we got all this stuff going on. We're going to hear Amorites later and Pezerites later. Okay, so we got all this fighting going on, right? And what ends up happening? After all this description of war that seems to have nothing to do with Abram, right? That has nothing to do with Abram living in Canaan. Until we get to verse 12, and who is introduced? Who's mentioned in verse 12 or 14? Lot is mentioned. And as a result of all this warfare that doesn't involve Abram, doesn't involve Lot, what role does Lot end up playing? What happens to Lot? He's captured. Yes, he's captured and all his stuff. So Lot is now prisoner, right? Prisoner of war, because he lives by Sodom and the king of they lose, and his stuff is taken by the victorious kings, and Lot is now a prisoner. And then what happens? This is kind of exciting.
Somebody comes and tells Abram.
Yeah, comes and tells Abram, look, your uncle is now a prisoner. Now it says they go as far as Dan. Well, understand, that's interesting. Because when they say Dan is going to become associated with a tribe, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so what the person is doing is either he's referencing an ancient place name, or he's giving a location that's going to resonate later, that doesn't mean anything now, but he's telling this story to people who are living much later. All right, so it tells Abram, your uncle was captured, all his stuff, the king has him, bad news, they're going to do terrible things to him. And Abram says, lock and load. Let's go, boys. We got some
working to do. Right?
And so, Arnold, you take one group this way. And Sylvester, you take the other group. And what we're going to do is we're going to be doing some shooting, yeah. Some whooping. We're going to be whooping some, okay? And so they do this, and what ends up happening? They get him. They win.
And all the stuff.
And they get him and all his stuff. Now, little war story, right? Kind of sounds like one of those legendary stories. Warfare, all of a sudden Abram comes, defeats them all, and he's a herder, but he has people and defeats them all and all wins. But then in verse 18, we've got this interesting guy show up. And who shows up in verse 18? A guy named Melchizedek. Melchizedek, who is a king. Now, when you see Melchizedek, we look at it and say, woo, what an odd name for a mother to give her son. Melchizedek. Well, it's not so odd when you look at the Hebrew that's underneath the name. Because Melech is the Hebrew word for king. Melech is king. That's what a king is a Melech. Zedek. So we've got Melech, king. So it's like when he says King Melchizedek, it's like when I was in elementary school, they used to serve us chili con carne with beans. You know, chili with beans. But what the heck? This is sort of like king. That's because that's a part of his name, is king, Melech. But Zadok becomes interesting. And the word Zadok in Hebrew means righteous. And in Hebrew, righteous means obedient. A follower of God's principles. So his name is King of Righteousness. That's kind of an interesting name. Whoa, maybe it has symbolic meaning. I don't know. His name is King of Righteousness. Maybe.
He's righteous.
Yeah. Well, but he comes from a regular city, right? What city does he come from? Salem. In Hebrew, what does Salem mean? Shalom? What does that mean?
Hello.
Peace. He's
Shalom.
King of Righteousness from the city of peace. Whoa! Yeah, yeah.
Look what he brings out for him.
Yes, what does he bring out?
Red wine.
Oh my goodness gracious. He is the righteous king from the city of peace. Okay. Maybe he's going to be a hero, you think? He's going to be a good guy? Probably. King of righteousness from the city of peace. Sort of like Arthur from Camelot. This is too good, right? Brings out bread and wine. Now we want to hold off on communion imagery because that's going to be much later. But I'll tell you something, writer in the New Testament, only one of them, but one of the writers in the New Testament makes a big deal about this. Big deal. If you read the letter to the Hebrews, the idea of Melchizedek, the figure of Melchizedek, as sort of a precursor of Jesus, is really important. That the writer of that letter sees Melchizedek as sort of a figure that isn't really human.
Wasn't he one of the kings that came to Bethlehem?
No.
He was that.
Now, this is Melchizedek, and even in this story, Melchizedek in Genesis, this is it. He shows up here, that's it. So it's not like there's more stories about Melchizedek. This is it. And so the writer of Hebrews is going to say, now understand, guys, we shouldn't read this literally, because Melchizedek is an image for Jesus. And what he does, and he makes a big deal that Melchizedek, Abram is really going to be important, father of many nations. But Abram allows Melchizedek to do what? To bless him. So if the father of many nations, God's number one, is blessed by Melchizedek, that would put Melchizedek higher than Abram or Abraham. So that's why the writer of Hebrews is going to say Melchizedek is really important. He's the only one that uses that imagery. He just shows up here. Not only does Melchizedek he allow Melchizedek to bless him, but Abram does what? Gives him a tenth of what he has. Gives Melchizedek a tenth. So what Abram does is he pays Melchizedek a tithe. Pays him a tithe.
Original tithe.
Again, Daddy, why does God want us to give 10%? Well, let me tell you the story. Let me tell you the story of the King of Righteousness ruling the city of peace and our ancestor Abram. That's it. That's it. Because all of a sudden, Melchizedek, this is it. He's gone in the story. Gone in the story. Didn't bother the writer of Hebrews. Sometimes bothers us. Where is Salem? Is it? But Jerusalem is going to have carry that name. So we're going to have connections there with the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so we've got Melchizedek here blessing Abram, and how does the story ending? How does this story end?
His best man.
So he takes his men back and lets the other men go.
Okay, battle's over, right? This thing with Melchizedek, if you took the Melchizedek stuff out, it wouldn't change the story at all. Not at all. Which shows that what we're talking about. One other thing I want to point out, because this is really important, and I think this is going on, really important. Something to file away, but going on in what the Hebrews are writing here with Genesis, and I'll mention in just a minute. If you take the Melchizedek story out, it doesn't. It just seems to be shoved in there. The rest of it flows. You take it out, it still flows. So the Melchizedek story is in there. I think there are several reasons. One is he's a king of righteousness and he's blessing. It's kind of a God figure, the city of peace, that's blessing Abram.
God's happy that he's there.
You better believe it. But we've got, so we return to the main story, and we got the king of Sodom, right? And Abram has destroyed the enemies of the king of Sodom, right? And the king of Sodom says, I am so grateful that I want you to what? Take everything. Because remember, when they defeated the other kings, what did they do? That's booty. That's how you paid soldiers. You took the stuff from the other kings. That's what the other kings did to the king of Sodom. Took his stuff. Now Abram defeated, the other king, took away not only Sodom's stuff, but their stuff.
The winner goes to spoils.
That's right. The winner goes to spoils. And the king of Sodom says, I appreciate what you did so much. Now, there's no mention that Sodom, the king of Sodom, is evil, is wicked. Because that's not part of this story. There's no mention that they are evil. You did me such a huge favor. Take the stuff you took from the other kings. Take it. It's yours. And Abram says, no. Why does it become important that after all of this, Abram says, no, I'm not taking your stuff?
It makes him a stronger personality.
Okay, Abram becomes a stronger person.
Yes.
Okay, what else? I think you're right on. I think this is one of those things that boosts, makes Abram more of a hero.
Yes.
What else? Okay, humble. I was going to say, Abram is going to build what he builds based on not what the king of Sodom has given him,
What God has given.
but what God has given him. And so he doesn't need booty from this war that he fought to get his uncle out anyway. His destiny is going to rest in the hands of God. Now, that's the story. So we've got Abram established as a person now, righteous, a person in this land, having been blessed by the King of Righteousness, right where God wants him. He's got all these promises. He is ready to take off, right? I want you to go back just for a minute to the Melchizedek story. What is, who does Melchizedek, he's a priest, right? He's a priest king. He's the priest of who? To whom is he the priest?
God.
God.
Most High.
Most High.
What did you say?
God Most High.
God
Now this is really cool.
I left that part off.
That's right. Because in Hebrew it isn't. Because we're talking about El Shaddai. And all we end up with different people worshiping. Remember, in this ancient world, you got a pantheon of gods. And you all in Hebraic language, El is always the name for God. Arabic is related, is a Semitic language too. That's why it's Allah. It's from the same root, El Allah. That's the name for God. But understand, it's not just one God. You've got El Shaddai, God Most High. That's the proper name for God. I am a worshiper of El Shaddai, not of El Elyon, but El Shaddai, God Most High. What would Most High refer to?
Number one.
Up. What would be up?
God.
Sky, clouds, mountains. El Shaddai is the God of the mountains. Why are the gods of the mountains really important?
Because that's what they believe.
That's heaven. That's heaven. And the idea that the gods of on high are the ones that control everything, but most particular in an agricultural society controls weather. They control rain and storms. So when you worship El Shaddai, you are worshiping the God of the mountains. What I find fascinating here and so exciting, and I want you to feel some excitement, not as much as I do, because that would be kind of crazy, because I'm really excited about this. But what the writer is doing, and he's going to continue to do it, when we run across these God names, proper names, El Shaddai, El Elyon, what he's going to say, what he's going to indicate, isn't that these are separate gods, that they are all representing the same God. So what he's doing is taking this pantheon of gods and bringing it into one figure. And that is really exciting. And he's doing it intentionally.
But do you think condensing it is good?
Well, why would he want to do this?
Make it one story instead of...
Yes! He's making it one story. And that all these people, it's not that Melchizedek worshipped another god. We worship the Lord.
Yes.
He worshipped El Shaddai.
It's the same thing.
That's what he's saying. Worshipping the same thing.
Yes.
Not worshiping separate gods, so we should stay away from him. Because he's a pagan. He's worshiping the same thing. And that's what he's going to repeatedly do. He's going to be using the name, when he calls God, he's going to use the names for God that other people used to worship distinct deities. But what this writer is doing is he's pulling all these images into one figure. And whether it's going to be that proper name for the Lord, or whether it's going to be El, which is what we saw in the first chapter, or whether it's going to be El Shaddai, or whether it's going to be Elohim, doesn't matter, or El Elyon, or El Peor. All of those are names for God, but he's pulling all those images into one figure. Theologically, that is incredibly exciting, because he's taking all these characteristics of these distinct deities and combining it into the one.
He's the most powerful God.
Exactly.
To describe
That's
what God
exactly what he's doing. Exactly what he's doing. And theologically, tell me that's not sophisticated. What this writer is doing 3,000 years ago. Man, he's doing something that's absolutely incredible.
Sophisticated.
So, theologically, pulling together these images of distinct deities and pulling those characteristics into one, that is really something. That is more than, as you look at this, reminds me just how intelligent this guy is. How sophisticated in a modern sense this guy is, that he's pulling together these images, theologically pulling it into the one theos, the one El. What's that? Without a computer. Or Google. So anyway, now next week we're going to continue the Abram story. Now we're going to shift, not next week, but the week after, to the same person, but a new name.
Another name.
Another name. Because Abram is going to become
Abraham.
And that's going to be the plural,
Yeah.
of Abram. So we're going to talk, not only is he going to be exalted father, he's going to be the exalted father of many. But we're not there yet.
Many.
Of many.
What
Of
chapter would that be?
Okay, next week we're going to be looking at chapters 15 through 17. Okay, and we're going to explore the covenant with Abram and more, because that's really where he's going to focus. And in particular, we're going to see the same covenant. Remember, because we've got the covenant already mentioned twice. Once before he left Nahor, and then once after he arrived in the land, God made a covenant. We're going to see the covenant made twice again. And it's going to be coming from different perspectives. Actually it's going to come from different sources. And because we're going to see God, we've been in the Lord tradition here. We're going to see God reintroduced. So the other tradition in the next one.
There aren't major wars going on yet.
No, and I hope John would. Well, go ahead, John, because you know more about it.
When you term the term major wars, I mean, yeah, there were regional conflicts
Yes.
that thousands and thousands of people were dying in, and there was continual things like that. But when you use the term major war, I'm not sure kind of what you mean. Like, as in like a World War I, World War II kind of thing? Or?
I'm talking about, we've heard battles already. So is this just battles or neighbors?
A lot of things, it could be both, and I thought it was interesting too that, some of these were those agricultural communities, and you get warfare all the time when you have farming. You tend to see you don't tend to see as much warfare amongst the pastoralists and the herders, and the nomads, but you see warfare all the time in agricultural communities.
And why would that make sense?
Well, they want to stay.
That's right, they're staying. Yeah.
Plus, when your numbers get so big and you have one of those bad famines, you got to feed them people. So where you get that food, you go borrow it from the next community over. So yeah, I mean, when they talk about, there were hundreds and thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of people dying in some of these things. I mean, some of these armies were really large back then, but I think it's interesting that they mentioned that Abrams was only 318.
Well, and one of the this is almost this is a prehistory, and when they're talking about kings and cities, it's not even what they're going to be looking at in terms of cities in the year 1000 BC, or certainly not the year 400 BC. We're not talking about anything like that.
These are like self-made kings that had, they were city-states, in other words, like that city was its own political organization, and everything in between it may or may not belong to that guy or the next guy over, so I mean, they were kind of, they're not in the sense that when we think of Germany having a king and then having this huge, kind of feudal system. No, these are just like individual self-made guys, and oftentimes when those guys were gone, those places fell into complete utter disrepair and disrepute.
Like chiefs, like tribal chiefs is what you're
Yeah.
talking. Only agricultural, not hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, exactly.
And so one chief is warring against another, and his possessions are really limited.
Yeah.
It's self-contained because it's enough for him to control, with what he has. So we're not anywhere close to Greek city-states or any kind of nations or kings wearing crowns.
The term tribal group is probably a much better analogy than the city-state that I use. You're looking at tribal nations as opposed to, giant.
And that's why Abram, with his 300 as a tribal chief, but just as a herder, can destroy, 7 kings, because they're working with very limited resources. His is mobile, and we're talking about something that's very, very small and limited, but it's not presented that way. And that also becomes interesting. Why, as this writer, because the Jews, the Hebrews had words for chief. I mean, he could have expressed it as tribal groups, but he's not. He's expressing it as kings and cities. Well, there's an intention behind that. One, he's talking to people for whom cities and kings have residence. But he's also, I think, conveying the importance of what's happening. We're not talking, if I say, 100 guys over here fought 100 guys over here. That's not a very glorious thing. And they took the not much, because neither one had much. And scratching out an existence. They took our 14 bushels of grain. That was the spoils of war, but that was good because we could feed ourselves. You're talking about a whole different. In fact, and we're not going to be looking at it in Genesis, but when you start even looking at the kings of Israel, when you start looking at, and certainly the judges, in the land, who rise up, have enormous power, usually kick another group out, until they get kicked out. Even people like Saul and David. When you start reading the David stories, man, he sure sounds like a tribal leader that's leading his people all over the place, almost a mercenary. Not until Solomon do we end up getting anything that's close to, a royalty and a dynasty. You're still talking about military tribal leaders that are waging war with other tribes.
The more wars you win, the bigger you are.
Well, you kind of do it, and when the leader dies, you don't continue. It's not going to become later until the leader dies and his son inherits, usually because the son is viewed as God, because the father is viewed as a deity. And so my son is also a God. Therefore, don't fear me because I'm powerful. Fear me because I have divine authority and can bring down the thunder on you if you tick me off.
I have one question.
Yeah. And I'm going to, yes, go ahead. I was going to cut that off, but I'll let it go.
In
Maybe
America,
that'll be interesting.
our biggest fights out west were the farmers who came in to grassland and cattle, but there it's the opposite. It's the cattle thing, and these farmers are what?
Well, remember, in the Middle East, water is a pretty precious resource.
What?
Water is a really precious resource,
Okay.
at least in large portions of the Middle East.
Yes.
So you've got, if you've got an agricultural community based around, water,
Yeah.
it's going to be limited. I mean, to a certain degree, it's going to be limited. It's going to be not, in other words, herding, the animals that they're herding are all animals that are used to those environments. They thrive in those environments. We're not talking about cows nowadays and sheep nowadays, although, they're going to be a little tougher version. They're not going to look like the completely domesticated animal we have now. They're going to be tougher. They can eat less. They can go longer periods without water, those kinds of things. So they're tougher animals. So they're going to survive in those more harsher environments, as opposed to the farmers themselves now, who are tied to that fertile location, that area. I mean, that's one interpretation.
But you see how it's switched from then to what it is like now.
Well, one of the, and you're talking, the limit, you're also talking about an awful lot of land.
Yes.
And the settlements are very small. You got tons of land.
I mean,
in the West, when you had the conflict with farmers, the conflict came when the farmers started doing something that the cattle people didn't like. And what did they start doing?
Bringing them sheep.
Well, yes,
Raising on their land.
yes, but even something that ticked off them even more. What did they start doing? Putting up fences. When they introduced barbed wire into the West, that's when you have the conflict. Because as long as it was open, and I was farming, because farmers didn't farm. I lived out in the Yellowstone River Valley, which was close to dry land farm in Montana. You didn't farm I had a friend of mine dated a woman whose brother had a farm, 4,000 acres. 4,000 acres. That's huge. Here It's not huge there, but it's huge here. 4,000 acres. I bet you he didn't have, gosh, I don't even know how much he had under cultivation. It sure wasn't 4,000 acres. You know, he had a little bit, a lot of open space, which, you know, that you could use to herd and you could use to pasture. And out there you had badlands, which you couldn't use for anything, you know, but you could, and you could run cattle through. It's when more and more land goes under cultivation and you start fencing it because you don't want cattle tromping through your wheat. You know, so you put barbed wire in there, and even that's not possible when they're building fences out of wood, you know, or rocks. You can't fence off, you know, 100 acres. That'd take forever, you know. But when you introduce barbed wire,
You can have miles and miles and miles of material. You know,
Very quickly.
you can't have miles and miles and miles of trees out west that are just not there.
Yeah.
Badlands and things like that. So creating this material.
and that's going to tick them off.
There's something to piggyback on there too. When Ed was talking about, you know, the sizes of farm. When you read through like historical documents from just our counties here in West Virginia, Ohio, and you know, Pennsylvania, you know, a big farm was 200 acres. I mean, that was a huge farm, and it might be worth, you know, in 1850 might be worth a whopping $2,000.
Correct.
You know, and I mean, they talk about
$2,000 was a lot of money.
well, yeah, they talk about, you know, the things that this guy had, how many acres he had under cultivation, how many acres he had for grazing, and they always left a certain amount of their property wooded, you know, as opposed to clearing it all, and that would be for firewood production or maybe orchard or something like that. But yeah, you know, very, very small acreage, and that was not only to keep him alive, but that was that he could, of course, sell his surplus and take it someplace else. But, you know, it doesn't take necessarily a lot, but, you know, no pun intended. But, you know, and you know, the author in those chapters there mentions too that someday, you know, your people are going to be as numerous as the grains of dust there. You know, that's kind of hinting to the fact that there ain't a whole heck of a lot of people running around this part of the world at that time. You know, so I think it's kind of.
So there was a lot of space not being used.
Yeah, a lot of space.
Over there.
Yeah.
But here.
And two very interesting competitive ways of life. You know, the agriculturalist and the pastoral nomad. You know, two very, very different ways of life.
And like I said, that's going to be the tension. That's going to be and it's interesting when you read the scripture, even in Genesis, but certainly when you go into the later books, into the books of Samuel and the Kings, and the books of Chronicles, you've got this real tension, this working between the idealized herder and then the farming agricultural that is necessary because as political systems change, you can't have even an ancient state that's herding. You know, you got to have agriculture because you got to be growing stuff to feed people, population centers. And well, what you end up with is with these herding, and man, you see this stuff excites me a lot. When you see this herding idea and you see it in the Torah, you've got a place to worship God, a tent that you set up, stay there for a while, break down, carry to someplace else, set it up, worship God for a while, break it down, go someplace else. You move from that to a temple you build in Jerusalem.
Yes.
That you don't break down and carry around. That's an agricultural society. That's not a herding society. You don't build temples when you've got flocks that you are following around. I mean, why build a temple? You may be gone. You know, that's agriculture, and that's going to be the tension. And even when he's about to build the temple, you know, and David says, I want to build a temple. And David will say in the book of the second book in 2 Samuel, I want to build a temple to you. You know, Nathan's going to say, God does not live in houses built by human hands. Why? Because God moves around. And so should you. God moves around. So you don't build a house for God. Now later, they're going to say, yeah, you got to build a temple. You know, and that's why God's going to dwell. And you're going to do all this. And the temple's going to be really a special place. But it's that tension. You know, is God the God of the wanderer? Or is God the God of the one who settles?
That's not even a question. He's a God
Wow.
of everyone.
What's that?
He's a God of everything.
Well, but it's what the big thing as you move into later books of the Old Testament, it's going to be, are you going to worship the fertility gods, or are you going to worship the God who leads? And that's going to be the key. And over and over and over, the warning against it to Israel is, you cannot worship the gods of the land. You cannot worship the Astra. You cannot worship the Baals. You can't worship them. Because what they're leading you into idolatry, they're leading you into false worship. You got to worship the God who leads. That becomes really difficult when you build the God who leads, a temple to live in. That becomes really hard. And they're going to struggle with it. They're going to struggle with their identity because it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense.
I'm glad I asked that.
Yeah.
One final thing that I might have been a little bit unclear too. Don't compare these other groups, like when they're talking about these other kings and these other city groups. Don't compare them to Egypt. Egypt is a completely different animal. When we think of Egypt, Egypt is a civilization. It's a city, but it's more than that. It's spread out, and it's more of a kind of a cultural oddity. I don't want to use that term because you get the Babylonians and everything like that. But don't compare these other kings to, say, like the kings in Egypt or the pharaohs in Egypt, because Egypt is kind of in its own league.
Correct.
It's bigger. It's much more organized. It's in its own league.
And what does Egypt have that these guys don't?
Predictable flooding, which means that they have that agriculture. They can predict that every year that Nile's going to flood, and they're going to get their crops are going to be replenished.
Going to actually replenish. The soil is going to become richer because of the flooding. Yeah.
But they're going to lose those crops.
Yeah.
When it first flooded.
Egypt is perfect.
Yeah.
Because you got the Nile that floods on a regular basis, and you got deserts to the east and the west. Jeez Louise, you can't get to it. Wanderers, nomads can't get in.
People have been hanging out in Egypt. Depending on what your belief system is, for 300,000 years. So
One of the things I saw about Egypt was that they found out, how did they get the stones in the middle of the desert for the Sphinx? Well, they found, and I was watching this, reading about, they had water right there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it went away. Where'd it go?
Back.
Huh?
Back. If you can direct water in, it's just easy to direct it back.
And they used boats on that.
Yeah.
That's how big it was.
Yeah, they flooded the areas around the base of the pyramids, floated boats in there.
It has nothing to do with what we're saying there, but.
No.
No. Hugh is about to.
When I think of that, I've read, those guys built those pyramids,
Yeah.
and there's like 1/4 of an inch out of perfect square.
Yes.
What's-
Everybody
what?
always asks, because archaeologists are, how did they get their math so well? We can't even do math like that nowadays. And I'm like, well, they had the concept of pi, the mathematical calculation. And I explained to them that I know absolutely nothing about math. But if I take a string and I set it in the ground and I make a circle with that string, I just use the mathematical concept of pi as accurately as any mathematician could. So, I just demonstrated that use without necessarily knowing that was 3.41 or 14 or whatever it is. Once again, showing my ignorance of mathematics. But I just, so those kinds of things,
They were primitive.
Well, they were, I don't want to use the term primitive, they were actually highly technically advanced with the technologies that they had.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So those measurements, they had standardized measurements, just like we do. When we talk about feet and yards and tenths of feet, they had those same kinds of measurements. They were just somewhat different than what we use, but they were still accurate, So that when we apply our own mathematics to those particular measurements, that's why they're so precise. Because their measurements were precise as well. That's how they did it.
And when you add to it the fact that there were ancient aliens that were guiding and directing their building, then you have something brand new, which goes without saying. Exactly.
I forgot.
The aliens that came down because those people couldn't have handled it themselves. There must have been aliens. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we go about our living. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.